I want to thank DSN.
Tell us who you are.
I'm Bill Whitaker, and it's real exciting. This is very exciting. I got a good feel of how exciting it was when I heard Ruth Gibson speak the other night, and she started talking about 1968, 1969, and oh boy, was it fun. I mean, was it fun to listen to Ruth talk about how things grew from the Kent Committee to end the war to 5,000 people marching at the Music and Speech Building. I mean, it was exciting. And Ruth got excited talking about it. It was real pleasant. So one of the things that we're going to try to do, obviously, is talk a lot about what happened then. It's been billed as a reunion. And there's even a yearbook, thanks to the House Non-American Activities Committee. And I understand we're going to get to see pictures. Only this is a kind of a great reunion. We're going to have critique. We're going to have criticism, self-criticism, and that ought to be really a lot of fun. We'll all be home. Nobody will be here tomorrow. But at any rate, John Skagit is going to talk. He is from the sponsors, Progressive Student Network, and he's going to talk to us, tell us the agenda, and make a few remarks.
Yeah, okay, right now the college Republicans are outside in the rain.
Yeah.
They're protesting and their banners read, "Lenin loves you." Jobs, you aging hippies. So, if that's the worst anybody says about it, I think you're in pretty good shape.
Well, since we're so non-friendly, I went down there to invite these people up there just to get the other side of the story, because you're supposed to educate yourself on both sides. Well, they had to educate the public in the state and the directors of the war ourselves up there in the building too. So, I guess we don't really have anything to worry about, but I just had to be real nice and invite them up. And obviously they're not here, so we can make them up. Yeah, they may come up, so they may be up, so just go up and hug them and really freak them out.
Well, you know, for Progressive Student Network, it's been a real exciting week planning this and getting this together for you guys. There's been a lot of controversy, but we really welcome you, and we see you all as, we look to you as our forefathers. We've been really excited about your experiences and others. And your dreams and your frustrations about that era. And we look forward to sharing with you our frustrations and our dreams. And even though there might be some differences in methods and
why do you want to take over buildings? We'll blow up that bridge when we come to
When I was reserving this room, the woman that was in charge of setting these things up, you know, we were going over name tags and coffee, and she said, "Do you want some, some signs and banners?" And I said, we kind of looked at each other and I said, "Well, maybe some pipe bombs or." But even though we have our differences, I think it's important to point out that we do all share a common idea and dream, and that is that we're all married to this earth and to each other, and that's the most important thing. And welcome. the lessons that we learned and the actions that took place in 1968, 1969, and 1970, and then apply them to what's going on today. And those are the kinds of discussions that we'd like to see coming out of these talks. The first person that's going to talk is Howie Emmer. Howie Emmer was, as most of you know, one of the earliest and foremost leaders of SDS. Howie Emmer was one of the people in the Kent Committee to end the war when there were only 4 or 5 or 6 people in the Kent Committee to end the war. He was one of the first persons I saw standing out in front of the student union, taking a lot of crap, but nonetheless, every week, there it was at noon, out in front of the student union, with signs to end the war, in 1966. It was an example. Ruth Gibson was another one who's here tonight who was with Howie. It was a courageous example. It certainly inspired me. And it inspired lots of people. And it was from that movement that we were able to start organizing the following year. Howie went on to be one of the most important leaders in SDS, played a pivotal role throughout the year. After Howie's speech, Jim, he also did 6 months in the Slammer as a result of the administration demonstration. So he paid a price there. Jim Harvey's going to also speak. He's going to follow Howie. Jim also was an early leader and someone that was looked to in a leadership capacity and provided that leadership. He was there at the beginning. He was somebody that they took chances. Jim got involved, got arrested at the music and speech incident and was charged with breaking the chain on the door, $1.50 chain or something to that effect. And as a result was sent to prison. And when he got to prison, they decided he looked a little faint and sent him to a mental hospital for the criminally insane. And that was an enormously difficult experience, and it was a price that was paid because of the response of the administration and the response that was met as a result of the organizing. Jim works with migrant workers today. Howie's a teacher in Chicago. After they're done speaking, then we'll open the floor for general discussion. Howie.
I want to really thank Bill. His comments were so warm. And it is really true what he said, that the Kent Committee to End the War in Vietnam really was important and kind of broke the ice originally on this campus. Robin was reminding me about one time the kind of thing that we just kind of got used to facing, I think. But we would stand individual out in front of the union, and Robin was reminding me about someone in the dorm in back who blared her music really loud so that we would be drowned out. What?
She brought the phonograph to the nearest window to the student union and put on, remember this? God Bless America.
Janie Bible.
Janie Bible. No, Polly Aquilina. And then threw tomatoes down at us.
But I guess I think, on the one hand, those of us who were out there, and there were, in addition to the vigils, even though the vigils were small, I remember that we had a petition drive, and actually we were very proud that we got 500 people to sign that petition, and that was, like, what, 1966? But I think that it's clear, the truth came out later when U.S. policy in Vietnam failed. And she may have blared God Bless America, but we were the ones who were right. The first thing I want to say, I guess the second thing now, is this is so much fun! I really love seeing everybody, and I'm sure all of us will have even more to say to each other than we have already. I'm sure there are many more kisses and hugs still coming from all of us and to all of us. When I was asked to talk, so many thoughts went through my mind that I decided to write it down. So I'm going to, give it from paper. I want to thank the Progressive Student Network for organizing this weekend. It's great to be back at Kent, seeing old friends who are spread all over the map now, some of whom I haven't seen for 20 years. It's very moving to me to be on Kent's campus because the last time I was here, before this month, I was moved off campus. That was on April 16th, 1969. The fact that we are all here today, those students from today and those of us from the past, shows that even though they banned SDS from this campus 20 years ago, and banned some of us from even stepping foot here, they couldn't stamp out what we stood for and what we did. Right here at the beginning, I'd like to pay a tribute to Abbie Hoffman. Throughout his life until his dying day, Abbie fought for social change. And some of you will remember that Abbie visited Kent and spoke here. I was thinking that a moment of silence was in order, but then I was thinking about Abbie, and it just didn't seem appropriate. So I'd like to ask that we all give Abbie Hoffman, because of what he did with his life, a round of applause. I feel fortunate that I came of age in the 1960s, a time of tremendous political and cultural ferment, a hopeful time. While living at Kent, I and others made critical life choices that shaped the rest of our lives, and I don't regret those choices for 1 minute. Many accounts of the 60s downplay or distort the truth about the more radical things that happened. In schools, they teach only that Martin Luther King was a man of peace and nonviolence, and downplay the fact that he led direct action. Malcolm X has completely dropped out of the history books. Even some people who were active in the movements of the 60s put out a message that we should have been more moderate, and that the movements of today need to be moderate. To me, nothing is further from the truth. I think it was right that we were militant in our opposition to the war in Vietnam and racism. I think it was right that we in SDS embraced the need for a revolutionary transformation of society. For those of us who formed Kent SDS in the fall of 1968, that was an extension of the experiences we had in previous years. People did not become revolutionary-minded in the 60s because of some communist boogeyman that infiltrated our minds or our meetings, nor was it out of desperation. It was a logical consequence of the experiences we had. For me, it started with the Civil Rights Movement. I was a student in CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, in Cleveland as a high school senior. I was in student CORE as a high school senior in 1964 and 1965. I heard Martin Luther King speak, and of course, I was greatly moved by his commitment and his tremendously human message. I will never forget the sound of his big, deep voice filling that large church. I was also very fortunate to hear Malcolm X speak, to hear him give his famous speech, The Ballad of the Bullet. On the way home that night after hearing Malcolm speak, my friend's father was complaining about what a militant and what a hate monger Malcolm was. But what stuck with me that evening was the love and connection between Malcolm X and his people, the black people in the audience. I guess I didn't feel threatened by that, and I agreed with his criticisms of racism in America. In those days, we watched the news, and we saw black freedom marchers in the South being attacked by dogs and with fire hoses. We waited as they searched for the bodies of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, and it wasn't in a movie. We reacted with horror when they were found in the Mississippi mud. The Civil Rights Movement was like a magnet for me. Black people's courage and determination to be free blew my mind, to use a 60s phrase. The Civil Rights Movement projected a humane alternative in a country preoccupied with material things. People were taking personal risks and taking controversial stands in the land of passivity and conformity. The black struggle of the 60s was like a glacier moving over the land, leaving the landscape completely changed, transforming the terms that life had been lived under in this country. Black people were demanding freedom in a country where white supremacy was 350 years deep. Significant changes did occur. After all, before the Civil Rights Movement, black people weren't even allowed to sit on the front of a bus in the South. Probably most significantly, changes were happening in the hearts and minds of people. The government wasn't really listening. Mostly what the Civil Rights Movement was answered with was guns and clubs and assassination of its leaders. The word from the government was, why do you have to be so militant? And why do you want things to change so fast? The Civil Rights Movement showed us that democracy in America was a myth. In response to the experience of the Civil Rights Movement, a more militant and nationalist mood and politics came to be dominant among black people in general and within the black liberation movement. In response to the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, scores of cities went up in flames. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Southern Black Student Organization, adopted the slogan of Black Power and said that black people would only be free when they had the power to determine their own future. Black people, not the U.S. government, had to have the power. SNCC put out a simultaneous call for whites to organize in the white community. Many white supporters of the Civil Rights Movement at that point resented this new direction and withdrew their financial and political support for SNCC. This juncture represented one of the problems of the 60s, that many white activists who courageously opposed the war in Vietnam often could not come to terms with support for the black liberation struggle right here at home. So SNCC was calling for black power. The Black Panther Party put self-defense into practice, and they called for socialist and nationalist revolution. The Republic of New Africa, formed in Detroit in 1968 by 500 black activists, called for land and independence for the black nation, as Malcolm X had done years earlier. Groups like these, and there were many more, were organizing, not just talking, and getting a very receptive ear from their people. Many progressive white people were greatly influenced by this new mood in politics among black people. We saw the similarities between U.S. troops occupying Vietnam and the role of the police occupying black communities, the brutality, the daily brutality that was carried out by police against black people. From what we saw happening to black people in the U.S. and to other people of color in the Third World, the message that black people were a colonized people whose freedom would come through self-determination made sense. This is something I still believe today, and it continues to be an issue for white activists to grapple with. And of course, the other great influence on all of us was the war in Vietnam. The Vietnamese people actually won. I think they showed the world and us that people could fight for liberation and could win freedom against the U.S. government. This was the threat of the Vietnamese to the U.S. government, because the U.S. government in that point in history was a tremendous power and promoted itself as being invincible. This was the threat of the Vietnamese, and this was why U.S. imperialism poured so much firepower into Vietnam. And the cost was great. More than 1 million dead or wounded in Vietnam. It was genocide. And 58,000 GIs also lost their lives there. And now, along with violent repression against black people that we had been watching on the news, we also began to watch napalm children, Vietnamese children, run across the TV screen, and hearing lies about fighting for freedom in Vietnam coming from the president. The anti-war movement was a very radicalizing experience for me and for many of us, because as with the Civil Rights Movement before, the U.S. government refused to listen. They refused to listen even after 500,000 marchers demonstrated peacefully in New York City in April 1967. Worse, they responded with repression, and I remember certain experiences that shaped my outlook as clearly as if they happened yesterday. The first one happened in 1964, when I campaigned for Lyndon Johnson, so that Barry Goldwater wouldn't be elected. Johnson was a peace candidate, and what did he do? He proceeded to escalate the Vietnam conflict into the Vietnam War, with 500,000 troops at its maximum on Vietnamese soil. And he was a Democrat. I had been tricked. I'll never forget the Pentagon also in October 1967 that Candy Erickson and I went to together on that bus. That bus ride was pretty great too, right, Candy? There had been a mass demonstration of thousands of people that day in Washington, which ended at the Pentagon. Then when the buses left, taking people back to their home cities, and the TV cameras were shut off, and night fell, the federal marshals had their chance. Aside from the mass demonstration, a few hundred militant young people decided to sit in at the Pentagon. And at that time, that was a really big deal. Taking direct action, as the civil rights movement had before, was really a break with only, peacefully protesting. And the peaceful protests were very important, but this was a new trend, so people were there sitting in. And the government really hated it. I think they really did. And federal marshals that night showed how much they hated it, because they went around, I remember watching them, we were talking about this candy time, and they just went around, I remember them having blackjacks, I'm not sure exactly. They went around and they just beat people. And it wasn't to separate people, to put them in vans, and it wasn't to arrest people, they were just going around and beating people, answering them for the gall that they were showing that they would dare to take that kind of action. That experience had a big impact on me, I gotta say. Then Chicago, 1968, the Democratic Convention. Everyone knows what happened there. People were beaten and gassed. But why? For peacefully demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. I mean, that was why. They refused even to give a permit in the city of Chicago to have marches. And here it's 1968, and the war is pretty far along. So the Democratic Party had been sponsoring the Vietnam War, and now it was also sponsoring the repression. We were becoming turned off to the whole system, not just to the Republicans or the Democrats, but the whole system. Still, the government wasn't listening. And at the same time, there were alternatives out there that we could look to, revolutionary alternatives. The Revolutionary Nationalist Black Movement, and we had the experience of the Civil Rights Movement. The Vietnamese people. Cuba had just had its revolution in 1960. Workers and students in France had almost toppled their own government in the spring of 1968. So our movement had gone from protest to resistance, and now revolution seemed desirable and possible from what we were seeing. That was the meaning to me of SDS, that we embraced revolution and anti-imperialism. The system taught us, that we couldn't look to it for social change. We saw that genocide in Vietnam and what was happening to black people here were connected to U.S. policies all around the world, towards Guatemala, the Congo, Cuba, and all of the Third World. We learned that it was a system based on exploitation that we were up against, and that a human world could only come about when that system was done away with. I think we were right about that then, and I think it's still true today. Our four Kent SDS demands were consciously anti-imperialist. They tied together the war in Vietnam and the war against black people. They were, as Tom said before, abolish the ROTC, abolish the Liquid Crystals Institute, abolish the Northeast Ohio Crime Lab, and abolish the Kent Law Enforcement Schools. We were organizing people to see Vietnam as the result of an imperialist system. Kent SDS, we combined rallies, dorm meetings, film showings, guerrilla theater, and militant action. Yes, we were militant in our tactics, taking over a building in response to the Oakland police recruiting, charging into the music and speech building. But our militancy was not out of blind desperation, I don't think. It came out of an awareness that to impact on racism and to impact on policy in Vietnam, we would have to disrupt the normal functioning of society. KSU would continue to spit out second lieutenants for the war machine through ROTC. We would have to also be what was called extreme. But how extreme is taking over a building compared to dropping napalm bombs on children? I think our militancy during 1968 and 1969 set a tone and example for how students reacted here the next year when Cambodia was invaded. When students broke windows in downtown Kent, many of them in the bank, I'm told. Not such a bad target, considering, what banks represent, which is the oppression of masses of people for a few people to get rich. Anyway. I better explain that. Anyways, when the windows were broken, when the ROTC building was burned along with 30 others around the country, and when students courageously insisted on their right to rally on May 4th on the campus in 1970, even in the face of the National Guard. And by the way, the quote-unquote violence of breaking bank windows has to be seen as part of an insistence that the war had to end, and not as, quote, senseless actions by misguided and violence-prone youth who are becoming just like the system. We all grew up We all read that a lot of places, a lot of times. And let's be clear. The Ohio National Guard were the ones who were responsible for the killings of Allison, Sandy, Jeff, and Bill, not the militancy of the students. The Kent State administration is showing its true colors these days by the fact that it still hasn't built a memorial to the poor students who were killed. And now they intend to reduce the planned memorial by 93%. This is absurd. This is one more way that they are trying to squelch what was done in the 60s, the message and the courage that people showed in standing up to the war. And I think students here need to demand the construction of the memorial as originally planned. And I think people around the country, all of us here, should support this demand. And I hope we're called on to do so. Actually, after yesterday's, or the rally the other day, I'm quite confident we will be called on to do so. So, I think truly historic achievements were made in the 60s. Because of the Vietnamese people, and because of our movement here, these days, the U.S. can't easily deploy U.S. troops to quell national liberation movements, as in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And I think, we can say this over and over, and people say that. I just say that. But I think it's really important, because if you look around this world, people are still fighting in a lot of national liberation struggles. And I just think what we did made a tremendous impact on U.S. ability to put down those movements. I think also that the bridge the Vietnamese built to the anti-war movement was very important. There were many international conferences that happened with the Vietnamese, and I was lucky to attend one. Also, people like the Quakers would bring the Vietnamese first aid supplies in their boats. Yes, we were going around, Ho Chi Minh, and that was important, and we were carrying our MLF flags, and that was important. I think it was right to support them, because they were just in their cause. But also a lot of other things that were happening, like what the Quakers were doing, and the Vietnamese met with the whole breadth of the anti-war movement. and I think the support that they won was very important. I think the support that the Vietnamese won on the part of the anti-war movement laid the basis for the kind of support we're seeing these days that's being given to the Nicaraguan revolution. And by the way, I think it was a mistake for Jane Fonda to have apologized for her support. Another thing that was very impactful that sometimes gets dropped down of the movement of the 60s is that alongside the black movement, other third world people in the U.S. were fighting for their freedom and impacted also greatly on society and on us. The Puerto Rican independence movement. And there's a graphic here I see about the Young Lords, that were a main organization of the Puerto Rican independence movement. The Mexicano-Chicano struggle, people might remember the moratoriums, where Mexican Chicano people in Los Angeles had a very militant, rebellion against the war in Vietnam. The gross way the third world youth especially were dying in Vietnam in disproportionate numbers. The Native American movement, people probably remember Wounded Knee. The new stage of the women's movement was formed. And also a movement for gay and lesbian liberation emerged. People ask, so what happened to SDS? And I think it would be good for us all to talk about that. It's an important topic. I think a series of things occurred. For one thing, whether SDS people began building clandestine organization, revolutionary organization, which I think was correct. But in so doing, whether SDS did lose sight of the need to keep building the mass movement on the campuses. That's for that part of it. And then there were also other people in SDS. And other people were leaving the campuses to try to build in working class communities among youth there, and never went back to the campuses. So I think it was wrong not to have been on the campuses in the fall of 1969, on Kent's campus and other campuses. But I do want to say again, as I said before, that the impact of SDS organizing was constantly agitating about the war and racism. And the militancy that we expressed that the war and racism had to end, those things did lay the basis for the massive student rebellion that happened after the invasion of Cambodia and the killings here at Kent. So to me, when I added up for all the weaknesses, and there were weaknesses, the main thing about SDS was its strengths and its contributions. As to why the movement of the 60s didn't continue to have the impact it had beyond the early 70s, two government policies are significant to me. The U.S. government was feeling very seriously threatened by the extent of questioning and rebellion going on in this country. In response, they initiated COINTELPRO, an FBI program which carried out a psychological war against the black movement and other progressive movements, including the anti-war movement. And against the black movement, it was also a violent war. Hundreds of black activists were killed or imprisoned. Political prisoners and prisoners of war of the black movement, like Geronimo Pratt, who has spent the last 18 years of his life in jail ever since then. Those people continue to be locked down today. The government did something else that also had a lasting impact, I think. They ended the draft. This took a lot of pressure off of the government, since it meant America's sons would no longer be forced to die in Vietnam. Any assessment of our mistakes, I think, has to take these things into consideration. And there were problems and mistakes. I think a major problem of the 60s movement was male supremacy. Many women were alienated from the anti-imperialist movement because it was male-dominated. Women in SDS and other organizations of the mixed movement, moving with men and women working together, Many of the women in those organizations, including SDS, were not taken seriously by men. Often there was a competitive, male-defined style of discussion which turned women off and was a barrier to their participation. I think the male supremacy of the left was the main reason for the division between the anti-imperialist movement and the women's movement. I didn't see it that way back then. I, like many of us in SDS, felt that the women's movement really should not be supported, I think, is the way we thought, unless it was explicitly anti-racist and anti-imperialist. And I think that was wrong. Women's liberation should have been supported in its own rights. I just reminded that one of us called it the pots and pans revolution. Yeah. So I guess we were wrong. Women were always central to the thinking and the activities of Kent SDS, although they seldom shared the limelight. This became clear at the leadership of women in SDS, when some of us were kicked off campus, and it was they, the women, who came to lead the chapter. And if I didn't make it clear enough before, when I was talking about SDS organizations in general being, male supremacists, I think definitely we were here too at Kent. Sectarianism was a problem of the 60s. In Kent SDS, while there were real differences about the relationship of education and action, and other things I think became unnecessarily antagonistic. And we were too ready to sacrifice things that united us. And I just think simply that in the 60s, we were building a movement from scratch. We didn't have that much to go on, I don't believe, from traditional left movement. And we're just simply immature. I think we just did a lot of things wrong because our principles were right. And I still think the politics that we carried around many issues were very important and historic breakthroughs as far as left movement in this country. But I think we were simply immature in many things we did wrong because of that. A few thoughts about the Weather Underground, since many of us from Kent SDS were part of that grouping in National SDS. Weatherman grouping within National SDS. I think you have to see the emergence of the Weather Underground in historical context. It arose in response to the existence, the real-life reality existence of revolutionary organizations and movements around the world and here in the U.S. It was part of the fabric of militancy that characterized the 60s. The draft card burning, building takeovers, militant demonstrations, religious pacifists pouring blood on FBI files, the fraggings by GIs who were sick of being ordered to die in Vietnam and began killing their own officers. I think the Weather Underground, with its bombings of military and government targets, did play a role in keeping alive the need for a militant response to racism and to the Vietnam War. And yes, mistakes were made. We have to build movements that are both militant and mass-based. It is people who make change happen. And at times, whether SDS and people in the Weather Underground, at certain times, should have been more in tune where other people were at. At other times, like the bombing of the Capitol building in 1971, before the May Day demonstrations that happened there, I think the Weather Underground enjoyed significant mass support. While there was a macho style that characterized weather politics at particular points, I don't think that the whole reason that the Weather Underground emerged was out of violent machismo. I think there was an attempt to build revolutionary organizations during a revolutionary time. And I think that was correct. Also, I don't think it's right to characterize weather politics as white guilt politics. We said that third world people, inside and outside of the U.S., were the leading forces for revolutionary and progressive change. And that our strategies here, within the white movement, had to respond to that fact, especially being a movement inside of an imperialist nation. I think that was right then, and I think it's right today. It is Nicaragua, El Salvador, and the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Palestine, and South Africa, just to name some examples, where the most advanced struggles are still taking place. Did we guilt trip people with moralistic arguments and guilt trip ourselves? Yes, we did. But to me, that's different than summing up the totality of weather politics as guilt politics. So what about today? Over the years, the U.S. government has proved it is an imperialist system. The Democrats and the Republicans again joined together recently to sponsor more aid to the Congress. Today, life is worse for black people than it was 20 years ago. Blacks today own less than 1/10 of what whites own, and a pattern of genocide against black people is the reality of life. Infant mortality among black babies in the U.S. is worse than it is in Honduras. All this is true regardless of headlines in the early 80s about the emergence of a black middle class. More than ever, black people face conditions that do look like conditions of people in third world countries. These are not revolutionary times, but movements have been emerging and continuing. People are working for change in many areas, and that's great. I'd like to mention just a few of the struggles that are going on today. The fight for reproductive rights is before us now with an urgency we haven't seen in 20 years. If Roe versus Wade is overturned, many women will die. We have to be out there to stop Operation Rescue as they try to shut down abortion clinics. They have no right to block women's access to clinics. They have no right to take away a woman's right to control her own body and her own future. And that is what the right-wing anti-abortion movement is attempting to do. Along with an end to abortion, they want to return to the days when women were just supposed to be childbearers and homemakers, subservient to men. Everywhere these days, we still see billboards. Not just still, I think more. We see billboards and movie ads encouraging violence against women and sexual objectification of women. And these days, women are supposed to be liberated enough to enjoy being objectified. If Roe versus Wade is overturned, it will open the floodgates for more and more attempts to peel away the things that women have demanded and won since the 60s. And let's be honest. Today, male supremacy still definitely exists within progressive movements and continues to be a force to reckon with. The movement in response to the AIDS epidemic has given rise to a resurgence of the movement of gays and lesbians for liberation. This is one of the most dynamic movements of today and one that is growing. The 1987 March on Washington for gay and lesbian rights of 700,000 people was the largest demonstration for human rights this country has ever seen. The gay and lesbian movement challenges one of the most deeply implanted and one of the most backward aspects of our society, homophobia. There's probably not a person in this room who can't say that as they were growing up, they heard an awful lot of anti-gay jokes. Lesbians and gays challenge us as to how we view men's and women's traditional roles. In the anti-war movement of the 60s, gays and lesbians were invisible. What's worse, anti-gay jokes and remarks, so common throughout society, were also heard in movement meetings and gatherings. Homophobia exists in the progressive movement of today as well. We need to deal with that reality so that lesbian and gay liberation can be supported in the strong way that it needs to be. The demonstration last October to shut down the Food and Drug Administration was inspiring and courageous. People with AIDS, some in wheelchairs, went up against lines of police who were protecting the FDA building. It is sick that drug companies, supported by government agencies, are charging exorbitant prices for drugs that people with AIDS can't afford. And this is one important reason that people with AIDS are dying. AIDS has been used as a way to attack gay men and lesbians, but it is ridiculous to blame gay people for the AIDS epidemic. It has been their caring for each other that is the main reason that the epidemic has begun to turn around in the gay community. And as the AIDS epidemic changes, lesbians and gays are building solidarity with communities of people of color that are being devastated by the epidemic. I know that on this campus, lesbian gays have been speaking out about the harassment that they face here. And I think it is important that other students find ways to support them. We are seeing an exciting renewal of black activism on campus the past few years. Just recently at Wayne State University and at Worcester here in Ohio and at Howard University and many places, just recently, black students are again taking over buildings and again pressing their demands. Activism on campuses these days on the part of white students will ring hollow if black students' demands in confronting racism are not top priorities. From racist policies in faculty and student recruitment, to the Nazi skinhead movement, to the so-called drug war, and I really agree with what Bill said about that. Racism is acceptable again, and racists are on a roll. All of us, students and non-students, need to do what we can to act on the side of black freedom. Now this is a little long, just about done. Like a giant that is trying to keep its fingers in a huge dike, the U.S. government is still facing third world people around the world struggling for their freedom. These struggles continue to be a major force for social change and demand our support. I have been active recently in the Central America Solidarity Movement. The support of people in the U.S. for Nicaragua has been an important factor in that revolution's survival. And now the situation in El Salvador is reaching a critical juncture. Disappearances, torture, and all types of atrocities are happening more openly and more frequently since ARENA, the party of the death squads, came to power. Not that there wasn't a reign of terror under Duarte, but it's even worse. The people of El Salvador, from the FMLN to the mass movement, have declared this period an insurrectionary phase and call out for our support. We have to be just as uncompromising as we were against the Vietnam War and stop the U.S. from funding and supporting the war against the people of El Salvador. On June 1st, there will be a chance for all of us to help try to do this. That's the day Alfredo Cristiani, the ARENA leader, will be inaugurated as the new president of El Salvador. There will be demonstrations nationwide in the U.S. against his reign of terror. On that day, I will be participating in a mass civil disobedience action in Chicago aimed at shutting down the federal building there. I urge everyone to participate in the demonstrations in their areas in any way they feel comfortable. Marching, chanting, sitting in, direct action, it's all necessary, it's all important. We can all find something to do. One thing we did learn from the 60s is that what we do makes a difference in U.S. policy, and we can do it again. I'd also like to say that I'm a member of the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee, an anti-imperialist organization dedicated to the transformation of U.S. society into a better world for all people. So, I may not have as much hair as I did 20 years ago, but 20 years later, I still have that red shirt that I had, and no, that's not true. Now I have this shirt that I wear all the time. 20 years later, even though I don't have the red shirt, even though I don't have as much hair in my head, I'm as committed as I ever was to fight the injustices of the system that we live under. Thank you.
I want to thank Tom and Alan and the young people here at the campus for letting us do this trip. This is my second time on the campus for 1 year. The last time was when they were building the new maze. Flew out and came here for a day or two and got a feel for the place. But maybe it was too quick, or maybe it was the wrong time for me. This time coming here has felt like genuinely coming home. I dropped out of the school in, I think it was either the fall or the winter of fall of '68, winter of '69. By the spring of '69, I was outside agitating. By the summer of '69, I wasn't allowed on this campus or any other campus in the country. And they sent me to the University of Buffalo once. That was it. I have been on the university campus maybe 10 times since then, each time to go to a play at the University of California, San Diego. So I am not very aware of what's happening on campus today. But at the end of these 5 minutes, I'll maybe see what's happening, what I'm perceiving happening, and how I think it relates to we who were here 20 years ago. I want to thank one other person. And what happened to Vlad? There's a person who's here named Vladimir Lenin Schlomberg. Vladimir Schlomberg. I always got that pretty wrong. 20 years ago, Vlad helped me get a job. When I was trying to go to work in the factories, I was on a list, like a number of other people. And so I tried at Chrysler Twinsburg to get a job. I tried at the rubber plants to get a job, but my name was on the list. Now SDS, some segments of SDS were having a work-in that year. I was just trying to get a job. Vlad helped me get a job. In fact, he helped me, Bill Whitaker, and later Ken Hammond, who could not be here tonight, to have our first experience in youth entrepreneurship. We started the Red Star Roofing Company. The Red Star Roofing Company isn't the only Red Star that's a part of our past. These plates up here that my brother somehow magically has saved for 20 years came off the Red Star 1 press, which was here at Kennedy. When we first got it, it was in pieces. Some folks had been putting out poetry on it, I think, for some time, and for whatever reason it broke and didn't get fixed. We managed to fix it. I became the printer on it, the primary printer. I was taught to print by Terry Robbins in some of his first trips down here. Actually, I went up to Cleveland to run their press and to get a sense of how to do this job. This press traveled with us. It has a little history of its own. By the spring of '69, we were defending, some of us, the folks who called themselves RIB 2, were defending this from weather. We had armed, that's right, we had armed the location where this was so that we could protect it. Now, that's the beginning of what I want to talk about in terms of the kind of craziness we were into. I was a sculpture major here. But I think Howie, given the patina he has put on the movement and the things that happened, probably should have been the artist. I would like to be funny. It's not a strength of mine. I mean, I think it'd be nice to be funny. And it was my intention as I walked up here to be so. But I think that a lot of things went down during that time that are important for us to talk about, and it doesn't serve us well to cover them over, to gloss them over as a historic heroic movement that had some weaknesses on the fringes. I think it was historic, and I think it was heroic, and I think that the people who were here tonight played a very critical role in the history of the country. And that's all, the folks that we fought with and that we... But I think we made some serious mistakes, and I think they have relevance for today. So, if you'll bear with me for a moment, I want to talk about some of those instances. I too was at the Pentagon demonstration, and I was there that night when the marshals attacked the protesters. I was struck by a fascinating thing. One thing that Howard didn't mention was that it was not the soldiers. The place was ringed with soldiers. The soldiers did not attack us at all. In fact, there, to my memory, which is not really very strong, there was at least one soldier who left the lines during the day and refused to stand there and guard the Pentagon against us. The soldiers weren't very different from us. It was a replication of some of those scenes we've seen in pictures where the young women are putting flowers into the rifles, across the bayonets. For me, it was my first action of that sort. It was remarkably dramatic. And at night, I'd never seen anything like it. I haven't seen anything like it since. It was, the young people were out in the front of the Pentagon. There was the line of the soldiers here, and it was all backlit like a Hollywood set. It was magnificent with all the soldiers across. And it was a rush for me. And then when the marshals started attacking people, I thought it was horrible. I thought it was frightening. But it was so wonderfully romantic for me that I couldn't wait to get home and tell everybody what happened. And I didn't get my head bashed in. For whatever reason, I was either not in the line of fire or I moved quickly. The truth is, if I remember now, I could see what was coming down, and I kind of moved to the edge, not to want to be up in the front. It has never been a goal of mine to get my head bashed in. To my mind, it should never be a goal of leftists to get their heads bashed in. I was struck by that photo that we showed with my head hardly getting bashed in. That's the music the States building. And I was talking last night with Mark Rudd down at the, where the bar is downtown. Venice. My memory is not that good. I think Mark and I were talking at the Venice. And I was commenting, a number of people have come up to me, apparently who have seen this slide and have some memory of that action, and have the sense that someone said, well, hey, man, you were called non-struggle all this time. Look at this picture. You get your face bashed in. What I said to him was that, the truth is, at that moment, when we clashed with the jocks, these guys, by the way, I played football with years earlier, we had lost. That wasn't victory to clash with people who are ourselves. That was an expression of the failure of our organizing, not of our strength, not of our courage, not of the will of the people against the enemy. It was us. One of the things that has concerned me then and continues to concern me. Let me say first, I am not an activist at this point. I was never a movement heavy. I spent the last dozen years in one way or another working with migrant workers out in California. I've been out in the fields, I've been out in the encampments. Now I sit at a word processor all day. Still working with the same people, but I punch a clock, I sit there, I type up stuff most of the day. Basically advocating for migrant worker rights and programs to serve migrant workers. I have not spent much time in the last 20 years thinking about what we did and the significance of it. In fact, I've probably spent an inordinate amount of time trying not to think about it and to focus on other things. I'm not altogether sure why that is, but when I was asked to speak here, I accepted because I thought, heck, you guys got to deal with it sometime, and also maybe there's some utility in thinking about it. So, I really can't speak to the third world movements that are going on. I really can't speak to the issues of racism, sexism, and all the other isms that are really legitimate to be concerned about. I have a very narrow focus at this point in life, and I focus on the plight of migrant workers, because there's only so many hours in a day. But one of the things that I'm not sure where to jump to, and I told Bill I would be short, but I'm going to pursue this a little further if I may. When Howie went through his list of the various peoples that we are to be concerned about, that is legitimate. I have nothing to quarrel with that. I was struck, though, by the one group that seemed missing in that. That group was the workers. Guys and women working in offices, factories around here. The men and the women who used to work in factories around here, and they're now on the streets in San Jose, California, where I live, because the plants closed down here. About 15 years ago, I wrote a screenplay called General Strike in Akron. It postulated a fantasy at that time that the rubber company, I should say this, when I left Akron about, whenever it was, 17 years ago, they had signs up all over the place saying, "Hey Mac," on the billboards. Hey M-A-C. That M-A-C was Make Akron Competitive. The billboards were paid for by the rubber companies. What it really meant, it meant that the rubber union had to negotiate back on their contract. There were a lot of threats. They said, "No, guys, these plants are old. You're making a lot of money now. You're the privileged sectors of the working class." You didn't see those words, but they implied that. And they said, if we're going to stick around here, we're going to have to negotiate back on your contracts, and they did. I said, okay, well, we'll take that cut back. So my fantasy then, as I was leaving town, was that, and that became a screenplay, unpurchased, I'm afraid, was that the rubber companies would develop a secret scheme where they were going to dump this town, where they were going to cut out in unison, go offshore, do their production. And then in my story, somehow the people got word of this, and they did things. And it became kind of a 60s revisited story. I came back to Akron a few years later, with my camera in hand, thought, well, I'll take some pictures of the sets and stuff. I came into town, and there were no rubber plants open. I was amazed. Everything was shut down. What I had thought was fantasy was reality. And I was amazed that I didn't hear word one about it. Now, I live in a pretty insular world. I don't read the progressive newspapers, but I somehow missed it. And I have a feeling that not a lot went down here. I have a feeling that the student left, the trade unions, the other progressives in the community, somehow there was not an outpouring to say, stop this bullshit. And I think, to come back to Kent State, 1968, 1969, that we lost a classic opportunity here to begin to develop an industrial worker progressive movement. That was one of the things that defined the difference between what we for a very brief moment called as RIM2, Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, for want of any other organizational form to identify with, and what was the Weathermen. I dug through my my very meager archives, and I found two documents. First was something I told is something of a cult document at this point. It was one of the first things that we did here at Kent. It's called Who Rules Kent by Kent Students for Democratic Society. 15 cents. It was a bargain. I think we must have sold 25 of them, and I think Tom Love probably bought 10 of them. Thank you, Tom. If anyone can dig it up, it's a wonderful piece. It was put together largely by Ken Hammond. I wish you were here.
And Marilyn Davis.
Yeah.
Who was at the time his wife.
I think there's a copy mentioned in the archives.
Terrific. Look it up. It's great.
I have 10.
So
15,000.
What was significant about it, there were other Who Rules things done. I think Who Rules Columbia, Who Rules something, I don't know. There were other things done. We were sort of late coming to this, but we were late coming to a lot of things. So we tried to catch up. The significant point of what it does basically is it looks at who the trustees are here, who the regents are, and it ties them in with corporations on which they're on the boards of directors. Now we didn't have computers in those days, so Ken would read through the people who were on the boards of directors and would simply memorize them. And then when he was finished reading all these things, he'd say, "Oh yeah, Eckersley, or whatever his name is. Yeah, he's on this one, and this one." And then he'd write it out. The key, the message here in this for us was the same old message. There's a ruling class in this country, and there's a working class in the country. And that the interests of the ruling class and the working class are not the same, will never be the same, can never be the same, and that we need to understand that and act on that basis. We started out here, I was asked earlier today by Tom Brace, whether I thought that Marxism, Leninism, or ideology hurt the movement. I said I thought that idiotism maybe hurt the movement. I must also say this, that it's true, I marched around, I said I was a revolutionary Marxist-Leninist, but I was really a Leninist Schlombergish, or Schlombergish. It was a different Lenin, I'm serious. I don't think that Marxism hurt this movement at all. I think perhaps Leninism, whatever that meant, may have hurt us. I don't think that I knew what it meant. I did do some reading later because I thought, geez, maybe I ought to know what I was saying. What I learned is that Leninism probably was a very good and useful tool, a way of organizing things in Tsarist Russia. It probably wasn't all that useful for us today if we tried to apply it in any kind of strict sense. More importantly, I think people didn't know what the hell we were talking about, and we were not relating to them at all. Now we tried, after the split up, I was at that convention, that last convention of SDS. It made sense to me. I didn't like those PL guys. I didn't know anything about them, but I didn't really like them. They looked really straight. Besides that, they went to Harvard. And we all drove our Volkswagens. They flew them in. So it didn't seem right to me that they should win the election. So when Bernardine said that we're going to march out of here, it made a lot of sense to me. I thought, and as looking at that scene, I thought that John Reed had written it. There was light streaming in at this. It felt like the revolution. I think it was, first of all, I don't think we ever had a revolution. It was not a revolutionary time. But I think it was the end of the revolution, unfortunately. But I dutifully carried the strong box, by the way. I don't know how many people know that, but that became, because I was sort of a big guy, and somehow the national office knew that even though we were expelling PL, we were moving to another place. And we needed to have the money, and so I carried the money up the joint. And I felt like a robber, you know, filled with the romanticism. Another thing, you know, we did these posters. We did not happen to do this poster of Che. It was a wonderful poster. This idea of saying that a true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love is, I think, really true. I think we were also guided by great feelings of ego, great feelings of adventure, great feelings of romance, great feelings of identification. I need to identify with peoples in this world who were winning, who were struggling, who were good folks, and who our country was screwing over. In the process, we lost an identification with ourselves. You know, we were looking for a revolutionary class, and we were sitting in it. Again, I don't know about revolution, whether it could have been done, can be done, or should be done. But Kent State was not Berkeley. Kent State was not Columbia. It was not Harvard. It was not a ruling class university. We who sit in this room came from parents who worked in the shops, worked in the offices. My father was a meter reader. A bunch of people here had their fathers worked in factories or the docks, the unions. Their mothers were office workers. That was mine. We went here instead of working in the factories, in the offices. We may not be the worst off of the working class, but we are the working class. We were the working class. And we said, screw you to ourselves. We didn't want to talk to ourselves. Instead, and I'm not just saying this about the Weathermen, I think it's true for the rest of us. There was this sense that there was something wrong with who we were. So we didn't go to our natural constituency, who's our family, who's our real brothers and sisters, not our metaphoric brothers and sisters all over the world. We didn't even go to our own brothers and sisters, and parents and cousins, and people we played ball with and grew up with. We said, screw you all. We were going to identify with people we never even met. I'm not opposed to identification. I just think it's a classic opportunity to talk with ourselves and to do something that had impact. We did do, I think the last leaflet that we at RIM 2 did was a leaflet that we did in support of the strike at Akron General Hospital. We don't learn very easily, so it's the same folks that put this together. So we did an analysis of who the real scabs were, and we did the same kind of thing. We looked at who was on the board of trustees at Akron General Hospital, what corporate directorates are they a part of, and then we found, of course, that they're all linked. There is indeed a ruling class that transcends down to Akron, Ohio, Kent, Ohio, and that effectively controls the organizations we work for and we learn under. So we distributed this at plant gates. We distributed as many as we could afford to print up. They lost the strike, not because or in spite of us, they simply lost the strike, and they went back to work. And since then, most of us have gone on to other things in their lives. Let me say one last thing. I've been very much impressed with the people I've talked with about what they're doing now. There are a lot of teachers in this room, surprisingly. There's a lot of teachers. There are no captains of industry. There are a lot of teachers. There are too many attorneys, perhaps. But but people are doing good work. One final thing then. In spite of all the good works that we're doing now, I think it's unfortunate that we're doing those things. I think we have a lost generation, the old guys and women in this room are a lost generation to this country. we're the last group of people that did any good on our SAT test, right? It's downhill. It's
You're funny.
I told Bill Whitaker last night, repeatedly, that my advice to the young people of today was going to be, get married, get a house while you can, and live in the suburbs, raise your kids.
And I suggested you be careful with
And he
that.
said, be careful. Actually, that's why I thought, I was sort of kidding him. But as I thought about it, I thought it made a lot of sense. And after all, that's what a bunch of us have done.
He's one of the lawyers, too.
Yeah, and one of the lawyers. I think we have extraordinary challenges ahead of us as a nation and as a world. They aren't simply the challenges that we need to deal with in terms of identifying with and helping oppressed people that are around us. I think we have a moral responsibility. I think we have a practical responsibility to do that. I also think there are other issues that it's hard, of immensely important issues, it's hard to say what's more important than another, at least of importance that needs to be dealt with. I think we have to really work at preventing nuclear war. I think we have to prevent the kind of Malthusian disaster that we're heading toward, overpopulation. Overpopulation, under-resources. I think we have to really look at the kind of ecological disasters that may have already gone beyond the point of no return. And the only way to do that is to use our best resources we have to attack those issues. And I don't mean attack them from the position of working for corporate America or for working for the man. But we need a well-educated population. We probably don't need any more lawyers or social workers or social do-gooders. I think we need a generation of people who work hard, who study in the schools, who have a class consciousness, who understand that the people who are running the game are not going to save us. Those people are going to take our jobs and they're going to throw them away. They've internationalized their capital. They don't give a shit whether that production is done here in Akron or whether it's done in Tokyo, because they're getting their piece of the action anyway. But I care whether it happens in Tokyo. And I care about whether they're wasting our resources, whether they're manipulating us. But the issues are so complex that we can't do it as a bunch of generalists. So I say, hey, if you like your math, become a commie engineer, or become a progressive engineer, or become whatever that is, but become it. And you gotta go with what drives you, with where you feel passionate about it. I say don't drop that thing, as many of us did. I mean, there's a reason why we're elementary school teachers and we're these other things, and maybe not the things that we started out in this school. And that's because those are the jobs that were left to us. After we did our thing, after we decided, got kids, we got to send them to college, we should got good clothes over on their backs. So we went back to go to work. And those are the jobs that were open to us. I'm suggesting you continue it. It doesn't mean you continue your education, continue your work, don't drop out and start over stuff. Finish it and take us forward into the 21st century in a somewhat better way, or at least with a better chance than we got now. Thank you.
Is Carl Davidson. Carl Davidson was raised in Aliquippa, a steel mill town in western Pennsylvania. A graduate of Penn State University, he joined SDS in 1965 while on the faculty at the University of Nebraska. He was elected SDS Vice President in 1966 and remained so until 1967, and served as inter-organizational secretary 67 through 68. He was news editor of The Guardian, a New York-based weekly, for 8 years. Davidson was also a member of the National Steering Committee for the 3 major anti-war coalitions. Widely published in the Left and the Alternative Press, he is currently a contributing editor to Unity, the newspaper of the League for Revolutionary Struggle. I introduce you to Carl Davidson.
Thanks for the introduction. As SDS's interorganizational secretary, some of us were talking last night about it might be a good idea if we reconstituted the SDS chapter here for a short time, and as interorganizational secretary, get off a letter of solidarity to the Students for a Democratic Society in Beijing. Some of you may recognize from my accent, I grew up not too far from here in the hill country, in Milltown, western Pennsylvania, and Alabama, not too far from the western border. The time I grew up and went to high school was in the late 1950s. The times were gray, sullen, silent. Being a teenager in the Eisenhower years was a lot different than what most young people confront today. As a group, the young kids I grew up with were bright, but we were alienated and rebellious. A lot of us were into wearing gang jackets, and I guess we were what we call greasers today. We liked Hank Williams songs and country and western music. But the first record I ever bought was Heartbreak Hotel by Elvis Presley on a 78 RPM. What was happening was a big cultural change, and a lot of us trying to figure out who we were and what was happening. James Dean had just been killed. He had put out a movie called Rebel Without a Cause, which I remember sitting through about 11 times in the State Theater in downtown Alabama, trying to understand what the message he was putting across, which I understood emotionally and instinctively, but was still trying to figure out just who we were. One thing that took place that made a big cultural shift that was the birth of rock and roll, and Elvis, in fact, was a very important figure, especially if you think back about what rock and roll music really was and what it meant for our generation. Rock and roll music was really the marriage of country and western music on the one hand and black rhythm and blues on the other. And it caused a cultural split. My father, who was an automobile and truck mechanic, was no ethnomusicologist, but he understood what rock and roll was, and he didn't particularly care for it. I think his term for it was jungle music. But, and it caused the beginnings of a lot of grief and conflict and debates between him and me. And it wasn't just something that was particular to me, but was something that happened with a lot of young people at our time. What was happening was a cultural split that made up a generational revolt. We didn't know who we were or what we wanted, but we knew one thing, that we didn't want to continue the kind of hypocrisy in the middle class of the culture that America had back at that time. In 1961, I had the good luck to get to the university, and I went to Penn State. On the campus, we were also confronted with a contradiction. On one hand, if you were a freshman back then, as many of you probably remember, because I'm sure it was true here at Kent as well, ROTC was compulsory, along with your trip card and your freshman beanie that they passed out. We all got an Army uniform. On the other hand, the culture that I fell into, because of the beginnings in rock and roll, also because of the first book of poetry I was ever given to read was a book called How, Another Poem by Ellen. And one of the first novels I ever read was called On the Road by Jack Kerouac. I got into a lot of jazz music. I traveled around the country to different jazz concerts, to the Newport Jazz Coast Festival where they had a big riot. I think the most important thing about all of that is it was the beginning of an interracial cultural milieu. What we were discovering, although I'd never heard of it at that time, was a lesson that W.E.B. Du Bois had pointed out decades previously in his book, The Soul of the Black Folk, which is the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. And what was happening with our generation, or was beginning to happen to it, is that we were crossing the color line in our culture, in our activities, in our friends, and it was beginning to break down. And it was the seeds of a generational revolt. So in 1960, when we saw 4 black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, put on their Sunday best, get their Bibles and their school books, and go to a Woolworth's lunch counter and order a cup of coffee, which in the context of that time was a revolutionary act, and it caused an explosion that many of us, because of the kinds of changes that we've been brought through culturally, took personally. We saw it as an affront to our friends, and we also saw it as an affront to the deepest democratic values of what we were all taught that America was supposed to represent. Lots of times when I give these talks, I say that I thought back then that we were the last generation that really believed in the democratic values. I don't know if that would make that point now because there's a new rebirth of democracy going on in the world. But it was certainly part of what attracted me to SDS, and it was certainly the values I was operating off of when we responded to the civil rights struggle. What was happening was this, to put it in a nutshell. The young blacks who decided to exercise the promise of American democracy posed the question of democracy not only for themselves, but they posed it for all of us. And by responding to that, we ignited a process that went on to transform a whole generation. Here's the inner tension that created us. Imagine those of us who responded to these cities and the freedom rides and went south, went into Mississippi, did the voter registration. Imagine a generation of young students who had confronted the KKK, had stood up to violence and terror, had come to see a side of America that was the most open and blatant dictatorship of class and white supremacy. Imagine that, going through that, and then seeing our friends hurt, jailed, and killed. And then you come back to campus, because not all of us went down there for a long time. Some for a few weeks, some for a few months, some for longer. But eventually many of us came back to the campus. When you come back to the campus and you want to raise money for your SNCC chapter that you had worked with in, say, Mississippi, the administration tells you you're not allowed to set up the literature table. Or that the women who had braved the KKK are told that they have to be back in their dorms by 11 during a weeknight. And that the Dean of Women will expel them if they violate it. Also imagine the escalation of the war in Vietnam, and especially if you came from working class high schools like in Alabama or where many of you came from. You start to know people who were drafted, sent to Vietnam, hurt, even killed. And then you listen to Lyndon Johnson on the television telling you that the reason we're in Vietnam is to defend freedom and democracy. And then you say, wait a minute, but we know from our own experience that they don't even have freedom and democracy here in Mississippi. We knew it was a lie there. How could it be that they were telling the truth about Vietnam so far away? A number of people last night spoke a lot about the step-by-step growth of the anti-war movement, both here at Kent and in the country as a whole. So I won't go into that too much, because I know we're going to be pressed for time. But I think that one thing, there's a couple points that we should all keep in mind. One is that you cannot underestimate the importance of the war and its effect in understanding our generation and what happened to us. The bigger the protests, the greater the war effort. The more we marched, the the more soldiers they sent to Vietnam. That's the way it seemed. And it had a driving effect in the radicalization of our people. We seem to be exhausting rapidly, one by one, the opportunities of democratic protest, petitioning, and so on. And it set up a dynamic that created what we call the move from protest to resistance. I remember my first anti-Vietnam demonstration, the big national one was April '65. There were 25,000 people, which we thought was tremendous. My first reaction was, I thought the war was going to be over. When I got back to the state, I ran down and got to the New York Times. I figured the next day, I figured, well, that was it. Little did I know. I want to make another point. I imagine most of you here remember what a cluster bomb is. But for those of you who don't, I'll tell you. And I think it's a symbol for a lot of what happened. A cluster bomb is a large bomb that's dropped. It breaks up into little baby bombs or bomblets. It's an anti-personnel bomb that they used in Vietnam. One of these things will slice to ribbons anything in the size of a couple of football fields. Cluster bombs are bad enough. But one thing that they added in the course of the Vietnam War are defense intellectuals, or whatever you want to call them. They stopped making cluster bombs out of metal and began to make them out of hardened plastic. And the reason, there was only one reason to make them out of plastic rather than metal. It's that when they shattered and the little pieces of plastic entered people's bodies, that the Vietnamese would not be able to use X-ray machines to detect where the shrapnel was. And it would cause untold suffering and misery. And the idea was to terrorize and demoralize the population. Now, if you could hold that thought in your mind, I want you to think about who the real terrorists were. When you think of some of the extremes that our movement went to, although not even all of us agreed with it back then, we have to keep things in perspective. Whatever you can say about us, we did not have the blood of a million Vietnamese on our hands. And the people who do are still walking around as national elder statesmen. Word up, right. Started as a minority, but we eventually became a majority. We did it through a lot of hard work, organizing, militancy, mass outreach, but at one point we became a majority. I think one of the best things of our time that I think back on that symbolizes that transition from a minority to majority was when 5,000 returning Vietnam veterans marched in D.C. as part of a much larger demonstration, an Operation Dewey Canyon, and ended up at the Capitol for all day long under the TV cameras. Took their medals that they had won in Vietnam and threw them back to protest the war. That was covered on national media, got into Playboy magazine, every barbershop in the country. When the impact of that came across, that these guys had the kind of moral authority that they had actually been in Vietnam and had come to turn against the war. And some of those guys are here today. But that was, I think, a turning point where our movement became a majority of the Americans. One topic that's coming up this weekend is what happened to SDS. I think that it's fruitful to look at it, to try and understand it. I don't think it's fruitful to dwell on it forever, because some of these issues will never be settled. I think at certain points you have to stop dwelling on the past and begin to look to the future. But to throw in my 2 cents worth, I would put it in 3 points in terms of trying to define what happened to SDS. One is what was called, I would call or others of us actually would call the white blind spot. And that term also came from W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that there was a blind spot in the eyes of America that hindered it from being able to see reality. And that's when it tried to understand America through white eyes only. I think that was part of the problem with those of us in SDS. The irony was this: while it was black students fighting in the South that gave the impetus that helped create our movement, when the black protests and revolt came home to the campuses, it also helped to divide our movement, because some of us were able to see only part and not the whole. I remember we passed an anti-racism proposal at the SDS National Conference, and I went back to Penn State. I know at Penn State the chapter had a different line, but at Penn State I asked the chapter there what they were doing to implement the anti-racism proposal. They said, well, they weren't paying any attention to it because there wasn't much of a problem of racism at Penn State because there were only a handful of blacks. So you could begin to see that was the white blind spot. I mean, they were one away from it once we did some polemics and came around. But that was part of the problem. People had that kind of orientation in their thinking. It came up in other ways. Once we began to fight for open admissions, to democratize the process of admissions to the university, some of the students came up with SDSers came up with what we call the famous "what about my little brother" argument. We let the argument went like this: well, we let all these blacks and Chicanos and Puerto Ricans in. Well, how's my little brother going to get in? Because there's only so many spots. And all of a sudden, you find people in your SDS chapter start sounding like more backward sectors of the construction trade. Anyway, those were some of the divisiveness that divided SDS chapters. Some of those divisions were aggravated by a group called Progressive Labor. Others existed independently. But they caused a split that existed in many SDS chapters and this inability to respond in a unified fashion to the black revolt. The second blind spot, to borrow from the same metaphor of Du Bois, this is what I would call an elite blind spot. Many of the SDSers, because of the radicalization that had taken place, because of the frustration of being able to prevent the war from escalating, began to see themselves as totally alienated from the U.S. society, as an elite that was detached, as an elite that had contempt for ordinary people. And in essence, what they began to do was to see themselves as something special, rather than as something that was a product of American roots and American traditions. And once they had done that, it was a few short steps added the violence that the war had created to lead off into all sorts of adventures and the kind of fanaticism. The third point that I want to get into and actually develop some is what I would call a theoretical blind spot. I think that part of the problem was trying to define who we were then and who we are now. Not only, and by we, I mean not only the students today, but who we are today, being the children of the 60s and the 80s and 90s. We tried to determine this in SDS with many countless debates on the question of agency. Who was the revolutionary agency that could transform society? And it went from all sorts of different things. So the university community is an agency of social change, to interracial movement, or to working class, to the third world, to a theory that I was associated with briefly called the theory of the new working class. We made some beginnings in our attempt to develop an analysis of this. We had some idea that things were different for us as students. Penn State was something new in a sense. So was Penn State. Prior to the Second World War, most of the students in the country came from the upper classes. But we began to see that in schools like Penn State and others, that more and more students were reaching down into the broader classes, the working classes of society, to draw upon the population. In part, this was a result of the developments in science and technology, the information revolution. And it was having an impact on the class structure. We were writing papers back then. We wrote one called the Port Authority Statement, which pointed out that the sector, blue-collar sector of the working class was shrinking, and that what was coming into being was a larger service sector and professional sector. And this is what we concentrated on in trying to begin to develop an analysis of the new working class. We saw the universities as knowledge factories. We didn't really understand the information revolution, but we started to think of it in those terms. We began to develop that kind of understanding. But the problem was that the upheavals that were going on in the world, the huge upsurge in national liberation, the storms that were taking place, led many of us to put some of this thinking on the back burner. And we took over the categories of Marxism and Leninism to help us understand what was in fact happening. And in many ways they did. But I still have come to think that some of our most radical ideas that is being borne out by what's going on in the world today was not so much our socialism, but our commitment to democracy and freedom. And that's what's being borne out in the streets of Beijing, and what's happening in Moscow, and what's happening in Korea. It's a radical commitment to democracy and freedom, the importance of transforming society on the basis of a new technology. Some of those ideas began in SDS, but were short-circuited. And I think that we need to begin to rethink some of them today. I'm saying that it's true that SDS was a product of the struggle against racism. It's true that SDS was a product of the fight against war. It's true that it was part of the problem of the question of democracy that was posed for everyone, beginning to the women's movement that took place in SDS as well, and reaching out to other nationalities and other forces in society. All those were true. But I think we also need to look deeper. And that part of what SDS was a response to the revolution that was going on in the productive forces of society. What's called the information revolution, the post-industrial revolution, or whatever you want to call it. Because the truth that I've come to see is this. We were becoming radicalized at a time of one of the three most important inventions and revolutions in human history were taking place, the productive forces. The first was the invention of fire. The second was the invention of the printing press. The third was the silicon chip. And the implications of the invention of the silicon chip are transforming our lives and our society in much more rapid and faster ways than you can even imagine. And are at the roots of why there's a fight around glasnost and democracy in China, and also at the roots of some of the crises today in American society. We're entering a new age, and it's a world crisis all around us. It's not simply a crisis of capitalism. It's not simply a crisis of socialism. It's a crisis of industrial society, whether it's socialist or capitalist. We're confronted now with problems of ecology, the ozone holes being destroyed, with the rainforests being destroyed. One of the most outrageous, the rainforests is being destroyed in Central America so that we can have Wendy's and McDonald's. They destroy the rainforest to create beef. All of these so that we feed cattle and then so we can have our cheap hamburgers. But when you destroy the rainforest of the world, you destroy the lungs of the world. And what we find out is that commodities no longer reflect their true cost. Because their true cost, part of the assumption of both capitalism and socialism, was purpose of the concept was to think that the things from nature were free when they're not. All of these crises cannot be solved within the context of industrial society. That's the lesson that's being learned. And it's the technique and knowledge of the new wave, of the era of the Silicon Shift, of socialism of the 21st century, is the only one that can really solve these problems. And the agency that can help do that is part of who we were and who we are today. Marx, when he developed his theories, posited the working class as the revolutionary class because it represented the most advanced technique and most advanced productive forces in social organization in its time, in the middle of the last century. What I'm saying is we should begin to do the same thing today and re-examine who is the working class and who is playing the most progressive, what sectors are playing the most progressive role. You try to analyze, say, the Jesse Jackson role. Engels once said that the one value of elections was that it was a measuring rod for the maturity of the working class. So, to take the Jesse Jackson vote as an indication among the white population, Jesse got votes from all sectors, but he had two blips. He had one little blip of support from displaced farmers who I did some work with out in Nebraska, and some in industrial centers in the Rust Belt of distressed and displaced steel workers and auto workers and so on, among whites. But by far the largest blip of support came from our sector of the working class. The largest sector. So if that was a measure of who was taking the most, which sector of the working class was actually taking the leading role, the idea of Jesse representing the most advanced possibility that was out there. Then you could begin to see it. I could see it. I worked in Harold Washington's campaign in Chicago, like Harold, where he actually, for a brief shining moment, had the Rainbow Coalition in power. At Harold's first victory parties, I looked around the room, and I could see that the truth of the vast number of whites were people who were in all the old SDS chapters in our area. And when Harold died, and 5,000, 6,000 I was stored in City Hall, again I looked around, and it was like SDS I'd seen any time. That's part of who we were. I went to the SDS reunions and began to look at people talk about what they were doing. People were doing a lot of different things, but for the most part they were not doing the things that the media likes to say that most of us are doing, which is selling out to Wall Street or whatever. Most people had the kinds of jobs where they were still making their values explicit. Maybe not as ostentatious ways as during the 60s, but we're still there. So what I'm saying is that part of our task is, again, understanding who we were and who were our friends and who are our enemies. How to unite with the vast majority, but how to keep the audacity that led us in this process of changing society to begin with. Our vision remains clear and steady. We want a society without class distinctions. We want a life without backbreaking, dehumanizing toil and scarcity. We want a world where no people puts their heads higher than anyone else's or bows down to anyone else. For those of the younger generation or the next generation that are here, you might ask, oh, I'm just a student. What can I do? Well, actually, you can do quite a bit. Don't worry about apathy. The 50s generation I was part of wrote the book on apathy. What we came to discover was that apathy was an unconscious recognition of powerlessness. And it was like support for Nixon. Apathy was a mile wide and an inch deep. And it evaporated and changed very quickly. I want to make one other point. One thing that always comes up in meetings like this, and especially here at Kent, where people were killed, paid with their lives. Some younger people worry about making mistakes. don't worry so much about mistakes. Most of your mistakes you can go back and correct. I made plenty of mistakes, and if I had certain things to do over again, I would do them differently. But fundamentally, I have no regrets. I feel that I owe all of you a profound debt. For a boy from Aliquippa, participating in this movement enabled me to do things and see things that other guys I grew up with could only imagine. But I avoided making the biggest mistake of all, which was to do nothing, to sit on your hands, to become an object of history rather than a subject of history. Not to take part. The biggest mistake of all is not to take part in shaping history, and to shape it on the side of justice. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Ms. Bernadine Dorn. Bernadine attended Miami University in Ohio for a year in 1960 before transferring to the University of Chicago, where she obtained undergraduate and jurisprudence degrees. She was active in the National Lawyers Guild before she joined SDS. She was elected SDS Interorganizational Secretary in 1968-69, the first and only woman to hold that position.
Speak into the mic.
Dorn spoke at Kent State in May of 1969 and was one of the principal leaders of the Revolutionary Youth Movement faction at the final SDS convention in June 1969. Today she performs child advocacy, legal work in her hometown of Chicago, Illinois, while raising 3 sons, ages 12, 9, and 8. Ms. Bernadine Dorn.
Give him hell, Bernadine.
I'm going to do something that I always argue that women should never do when they're speaking, which is to begin with some disclaimers. Okay. To begin with some disclaimers. One is that I went to an SDS reunion this summer in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Louder. Yeah, so we can see. Yeah.
Good.
The SDS reunion this summer in Poughkeepsie was a terrifically emotional and healing experience, and exciting and challenging experience for a couple of reasons. One was we had, and maybe you all here were seeing each other, some of you for the first time in a long time, had this feeling. I had this overwhelming wave of feeling that I had forgotten how funny everybody was, how much I loved, had enormous feelings of love for people, and how much this was the group of people that I wanted to figure out the world with. And that notion of an intentional community that we created, a group who chose each other to figure out the world, was a very powerful experience. Connected to that was something that has made me very uncomfortable here and makes me uncomfortable standing here speaking. There was a women's workshop at the SDS Reunion. It was scheduled, as it always used to be, you'll remember, as one of many workshops that you could choose from. All the women went to it, so there were 106 women sitting in a circle on the lawn. And we started talking, and we went all day virtually, because going around the room took that long. And we heard things from each other that we had never heard from people we worked with very closely for years at a time. And I don't know what the form is here, but I wish that we could take my time now, lunchtime, this afternoon or something. It's a beautiful day out. and women could sit and talk here. I think otherwise we're replicating very much a, smoke-filled room with the people who are comfortable doing public speaking, which is almost all men usually doing the speaking. And I don't want to feel like I can't represent women, and I don't, and I can't speak that part of the truth. So I'd like to make this to the women here and to the organizers here as a serious proposal that we somehow do that. The second disclaimer is that I had a different understanding of this, and what I prepared to do, and what I actually used to do in the old days somewhat well, and still can do well, is talk to students, to young people, to people, about locating the anti-war movement and the Vietnam War and the anti-racist movement in a context and in history. So that's what I prepared. I didn't prepare to do an internal dissection of could we have saved SDS or not, what were the splits about, the issues of weather and so on. But I'm quite open to talking about that with everybody in a circle or in a community where we talk about those questions. So this, I guess, is a disclaimer that I feel like I'm holding this thing up, that I might disappoint you, and I don't really need to be speaking what we already know. But I'm going to go ahead and try to set the context that I thought that this was about the war, anti-war movement and the anti-racist movement. Beginning with some lines that I have come to love from Emily Dickinson. Believing in possibilities and not wanting to miss the dawn, I open every door. The 60s was an unprecedented opposition, ultimately an insurrection against the dominant social values and institutions of U.S. imperialism, fired by a vision of the urgent need for fundamental change. Flawed, imperfect, in some senses failed, yet the values and the spirit of the 60s, the ideas we fought for, the remarkable successes and the more intangible changes, our sacrifices and our best efforts. I think we were right. By the 60s, we referred to an overlapping series of political and cultural movements and upheavals which began roughly with the sit-ins of young black students that Carl referred to in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 1st, 1960, and ended with the U.S. Embassy, the U.S. defeat and frantic retreat from the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy. Images which I'm sure all of us will never forget, on April 30th, 1975. That period of time is what's called the 60s in my mind. Its antecedents include individual and collective acts of conscience and heroism, Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, and the remarkable organizing of parents and young black students in Little Rock, Arkansas that next year, sparked by a woman named Daisy Bates. We include in the connotations surrounding the 60s a generation bound together by innovative rock, folk music, and jazz, by rebellion in dress and relationships, by a questioning of authority throughout the institutions of society, and by dissatisfaction with the world we were inheriting. For me, the essence of the 60s lies in the moral force generated by the civil rights, black liberation, and anti-war movements. From that torrent of unease, unrest, were to develop the women's movement, the gay and lesbian movements, the ecology movement, the Puerto Rican independence resurgence, the struggle for Native American sovereignty, struggles for the rights of the disabled, the elderly, veterans, and a renewed and ultimately significant anti-nuclear and peace movement. We were authentic movements, creating knowledge, telling and hearing stories of our own and others' lived lives. Let me be clear, if it isn't already obvious, which it certainly is to us, that the anti-war movement was chaotic, inconsistent, messy, frighteningly small, and risky. We carried with us all the values of the dominant culture: arrogance, individualism, sexism, and racism. We were riddled with posturing, sectarianism, and excess. We failed to unite. We attacked each other, friends and allies. Replete with conflicts and inadequacies, we dreamed of being better, of shifting consciousness, of changing the cruelties of American life and ourselves irrevocably. Our motive in organizing and acting was not guilt, but an accurate recognition that as 6% of the world's population, the United States controls over 60% of the world's wealth, still true today. We tried to reckon with the privileges of being white in America, not as a psychological problem, but as W.E.B. Du Bois most eloquently described it a century ago, because as whites, we too were robbed of our full humanity by taking on the role of oppressor, even as passive oppressor. As white students, youth, and women, we concluded that we were responsible for what the government did in our name, and that our dignity lay with the liberation of the third world, not as acquiescent citizens reveling in the good life of consumerism and career. There is another nostalgic TV view of 60s history, which sells more jeans and music and artifacts, but is in fact a smoothed out, content and conflict-free, homogenized, unthreatening distortion. Other views, some of them by participants in the movement, now say that we went berserk back then, lost the true path. We only intended to reform the Democratic Party. This is a view that has made peace with more conservative times, that offers history stripped of context and reinforces, in my mind, the inequities and status quo of the Reagan era. I think that to best capture the complexity as well as the spirit and the substance of the 60s, we must turn to art rather than memoir so far. The novel Meridian by Alice Walker, the poetry of Sonia Sanchez and Marge Piercy, music, of course, and the theater of Abby Hoffman. I was a girl born to lower middle class parents, raised in Chicago and Milwaukee, the first in my family to attend college. I got into the movement working for Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference on the west side of Chicago in 1965. As a law student, I taught tenants' rights and organized legal support for a citywide rent strike called by King as part of an open housing drive. On weekends, we marched into the segregated white neighborhoods of Chicago, calling forth the same white hatred that struck me as a 13-year-old watching the crowds on TV spitting at students in Little Rock. Observing these veteran organizers from the South at work in the black community of Chicago, I saw a range of tactics and strategy being brought to bear. Churches on hot summer nights packed to overflowing, waiting for hours to hear Reverend King. Programs to address people's concrete needs for decent housing and education for their children. Defying eviction orders and moving furniture back in after the sheriff had moved it out on the street. Mass mobilization and confrontation, witnessing with your body. It's impossible to overstate the impact and influence which the civil rights and black movement had on the movement against the Vietnam War. I want to remind those of you who were there and give those of you who were not a tiny flavor of those turbulent times, beginning with the crucible year of 1968 and culminating in those long 13 seconds when 61 shots were fired at Kent State. This, in a way, I'll do this real quickly because in a way the slideshow did what I was trying to do here with just saying how fast events happened and what the context was those last few years of the 60s.